Welcome to today's webinar, Transportation, Climate, and Equity, a Smart Growth Dialogue, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, which is supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and is managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. Today's program is the fifth offering of Planning with Purpose, a Smart Growth Network webinar series on community revitalization. In this series, the Smart Growth Network is sharing new ideas and approaches taken from current planning issues and case studies that have made us aware of the need to broaden our smart growth lens. We want to share with and learn from you with the hope that together we can create communities of the future that are healthy, equitable, and resilient for everyone. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. And I'm actually going to correct that. This session is eligible for it. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Transportation, Climate, and Equity, a Smart Growth Dialogue. You can also search for event number 920-8637. So to get started, our guests today are Beth Osborne, Stephanie Gidigbi, and Chanell Fletcher. Beth Osborne is the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit of local, regional, and state leaders who envision a transportation system that safely, affordably, and conveniently connects people of all means and ability to jobs, services, and opportunity through multiple modes of travel. She was previously at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. At U.S. DOT, Beth managed the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, the Secretary's Livability Initiative, the development of the administration's Surface Transportation Authorization Proposal, and the implementation of MAP 21. Before joining DOT, Beth worked for Senator Tom Carper as an advisor for transportation, trade, and labor policy, as the policy director for Smart Growth America, and as legislative director for an environmental policy at the Southern Governors Association. Stephanie Gidigbi champions public policy solutions that promote economic, social, and environmental benefits for communities. She directs policy and partnerships for the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, Healthy People, Thriving Communities program, where she advances federal campaigns, coalition efforts, social equity, and climate justice strategies. Stephanie served as a political appointee in the Obama administration, where she advanced the administration's economic opportunity agenda at the U.S. Department of Transportation. She also served as the New Jersey Director of Public Engagement, overseeing the Hurricane Sandy Task Force under the leadership of the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, to support the federal disaster response in the region. She began her career on Capitol Hill and is based in NRDC's Washington, D.C. office. As the Executive Director of Climate Plan, Chanell Fletcher oversees network partners and staff efforts on state and regional policy to help California communities become more healthy, equitable, and sustainable. Chanell has more than 10 years of experience working on policy issues related to climate change, land use, and transportation. She sits on the board of the Planning and Conservation League and California Walks. Previously, as the organization's associate director, Chanell led Climate Plan's policy campaigns, and prior to that, as senior California policy manager for the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, she worked with state agencies and state legislature to support safe walking and bicycling for children and families, especially in low-income communities throughout California. Following their discussion, Beth, Stephanie, and Chanell will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during their discussion by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth Osborne, who is going to lead the discussion with a short presentation. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today, and I'm super excited to share this conversation with Chanell and Stephanie. I'm going to give a little overview about the connection between transportation as well as the entire built environment with climate and equity. I'm going to hand things over to Chanell to talk about what's going on in these issues in her neck of the woods, California, and then we're going to bring it back to Stephanie, who's going to bring these issues back up to the national level. So just quickly, transportation emissions are rising, and it is the largest emitter sector-wise of greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see here. It's been growing and overtook the electric utility sector. One, because electric utilities have gotten more efficient and transportation has continued to get less efficient. Some of this is due to the fact that the way we've developed our communities has led to more and more people driving further every single year. And this creates a huge challenge in terms of accommodating them, but it also creates a big challenge in terms of cost. As people have driven more, it's undercut a lot of what we've done to make our vehicles more fuel efficient. We've seen efficiency go up, but emissions have continued to go up anyway because people drive so much faster. And so at least steadying that in preventing people from having to drive further to do their basic daily needs can steady that out and allow the efficiencies we're trying to gain to catch up. In terms of the vehicles themselves. As you can see, how much we drive is very much related to how much we emit. And a lot of this is due not just to the way we build our transportation system, but also the way we lay out our communities. The two interact. There's certainly the importance of building our roadways to safely accommodate all users of the system, but where we place the things that they're trying to get to has a big impact on whether you have to drive and how far you have to drive. You know, on the left, you've got cluster development in a kind of town center setting, where even if you don't live terribly close to that town center, you could drive in, park your car, and run a whole bunch of errands within just a few blocks of each other. It becomes easier to share a ride with someone, even if you're going to a different destination, because the destinations are close together. And then in what we see in the majority of the US on the right, each destination is its own trip. And even, as you can see, between the housing and the schooling, they're very close to each other as the crow flies. But in terms of the trip, you have to go all the way out of the housing cluster to the main road and then over to a different cluster for the school. So even as the crow flies, it's short, your trip is actually long. So that dictates how you're going to travel and how much time you're going to spend traveling. The way we design our transportation system can be a great boost to connecting people to the things that they need, but it can also create a barrier to getting to the things they need. This is an example of a highway that was built to connect people on one side of the highway to another side of the highway, from a lot of communities to that downtown. And while on the corridor, you might have a convenient and quick trip. If you're on the neighborhoods on either side of this highway, what used to be a very short trip, again, as the crow flies, is now quite inconvenient. This highway actually has more crossings than are typical. And many times you would have to go half a mile or a mile down your road to basically cross the highway and then back a mile. And that creates a barrier. It's undercut communities and split them from one another. Even just an intersection, we often see one side of an intersection that doesn't have a crosswalk, and so just crossing the street could require you to cross 3 times just to get across once. This is a barrier. This tends to make people either decide walking is too hard or too scary, or just dash out to make one crossing. And so the way we design our roadways has an enormous impact on whether or not that roadway is a point of accessibility or a barrier. When we build our roadways to be very fast, have fast auto movements, we create a dangerous environment for those that are outside of a vehicle. And those who are outside of a vehicle are disproportionately people of color, and they're less likely to have access to a car. And therefore, when these dangerous road conditions turn into fatalities, it's more likely to impact people of color. But frankly, it impacts people who might be aging and may not be able to cross the street very quickly, or very young people who aren't old enough to drive. And you can see the difference between 20 and 30 miles per hour is the difference between almost certainly surviving to 50-50, another 10 miles per hour, and it's most of the cases are deadly. So that's my overview. I'm going to bring Chanell into the conversation at this point and ask her to talk about what's going on locally in California and some of her work to bring these issues together in terms of transportation equity and climate.
Thank you, Beth. And I want to say that I'm so excited to be on this webinar with Beth and Stephanie, in part because in California, as many of you guys know, and you can see on my slide, we're doing really big things. And with the new president-elect and vice president-elect, I think there's just feels like there's a lot of potential to start to move these things from just being very like California or statewide things to kind of becoming more of a national federal focus. And so very excited to talk about that. If you guys have been following the news, you may have known that California has made some pretty big announcements. As you can see, California is going to ban the sale of new gas-powered vehicles in 2013. Really big news that came out recently from California Governor Gavin Newsom around by 2035, all new car sales are going to be electric vehicles. Next slide. That's really huge. I think in addition to that, if you guys don't know already, California, we already have some really ambitious climate goals. And so if you're looking at the chart, which is on my left, you'll see, we have AB 32. If you don't know what AB 32 is, it's kind of our first global warming law, where we said that we want to get our emissions back down to 1990 levels. Great for California, we've already done that, and we did it a year early. The trick, or the challenge, is really going to be getting to the next goal. We recently passed SB 32, and that is 40% below 1990 levels. This is where it really starts to hurt, because it means that we actually start to need to start making some significant shifts. And then I think, surprise. No worries. And then I think you'll see by an executive order by our previous governor, Governor Brown, it was to get to 80% below 1990 levels. These are all really, really big things. So what does it mean, or like how do we get there? Like what do we need to do in California? I think the key point is that we need to do a lot. So I think those big kind of shiny announcements like, oh, we're not gonna have any more gas-powered vehicles, we're gonna put a ban. It's a little misleading, right? It's like we're not going to do a ban, but we're just going to stop, we're going to switch the sale of new cars. But I think the slide on my right, what it's supposed to share is that that's not enough. Like we can't say like, oh, we're just going to do that and that's going to fix it for us. And so you'll see like 2035, just to get to that 40% below, we need to have 50% of our ZEVs, which is zero emission vehicles, to be sales, right? We need to have 50% renewables, but we need to have 7.5% total VMT reduction, which in like non-policy wonk is just like, that's how much percentage we need to reduce how much we're driving. To get to 2050, it's even harder, right? Because it's like, again, it's 100% ZEV vehicle sales, it's 75% renewables, but it's 15% VMT reduction again, right? Like we really need to get our VMT, or how much we're driving, reduced significantly if we're going to meet any of these goals in California. Next slide. But guess what? That's been one of our biggest problems. And I know Beth was talking about it at the national level. I'm letting you guys know in California, we are struggling. So this slide right here, what it's going to show you is that our VMT per capita is increasing. You're going to see our CO2 is also increasing. Those green dots on the screen that you see right there, it says anticipated SCS CO2 performance. What it really means is that for us to hit those goals that I just showed you, that's where we're supposed to be in 2020, which by the way, this is 2020, and that's where we're supposed to be in 2035. So you can see that we are actually nowhere close to where we were supposed to be right now, and we are certainly not on track to get there by 2035. Next slide. What I think in addition to that, right, so we have this kind of like climate conversation, and I think about these things as like we have like compounding crises going on right now. So we have climate change, which I think for many Californian, beyond like just looking at transportation, we are also suffering from the impacts. I mean, for the third straight year in a row, California has been on fire, literally. Like everything from the air filters, masks. We've been doing that in California because we're facing the impacts of climate change. In addition to that, we're talking about spaces that weren't built for people that look like me, right? So they were intentionally built at the expense of who I am. And so I think when we're looking at transportation, it's like, one, it's actually, increasing in terms of our emissions and further accelerating the climate crisis. And two, at the same time, it's continuing to burden BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Next slide. Part of why this is happening, I mean, we're not set up. Like the funding in California was never set up to prioritize Black and Brown communities, to prioritize climate change. I have this slide because I just want to make it really crystal clear for folks. When you're looking at the revenue sources in California, gas and diesel is the biggest, largest one, and you can see from the arrows what it's funding, and those are the biggest pots. People talk a lot to me about cap and trade, and if I think folks don't know what cap and trade is, I'll get into it on the next slide, but it really was this kind of program where we were like, okay, we're gonna start putting caps, in terms of on our emissions, we're gonna do some trades, and we're gonna get some revenue in, and we're gonna start to fund some kind of programs that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? But I think the point that I want to underscore is that when you're looking at how much it is, I mean, comparatively to the gas and diesel excise taxes, it's nothing. So all the like innovative kind of like programs that are actually reducing emissions, that are actually trying to think about how do we address equity, which is different than injustice, right? Like how do we start to like right size the ship a little bit more? That is like this much compared to what's really going into these roads and these highways. And I think as Beth kind of already explained, those are what have like split communities. Those are what are kind of burdening us in terms of like polluting our communities. That's what we're struggling with, what we're dealing with the weight of. Next slide. This is, I think, a really bold statement, but I fully support it. And I think I've been very inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement when we're talking about defunding the police. We're talking about tearing down racist monuments. We really need to have a conversation about roads, highways, and freeways and what we want to do. So if we're talking about climate, if we're talking about climate change, you guys have already seen, we need to reduce how much we're driving. We cannot switch over the fleet to all electric. That's not going to solve the problem. You actually have to think about how communities are planned, think about how they're built, and we need to realize that a lot of these like roads and highways were intentionally funded around racism and segregation. There's a real conversation to be had around how we are spending our money, and there's a real conversation to be had around, are these roads and highways the best use of our money given where we're at and given what we want to see in terms of equity and justice around Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities? So I do think there's a really important conversation to be had around thinking about racist monuments, freeways, like that is an important conversation. And I know that, you know, it feels very kind of revolutionary, but there are also like a lot of communities and a lot of examples of folks actually dismantling freeways and opening up spaces. Next slide. The last point I want to get into is cap and trade, because I think if I'm talking about racist monuments and talking about freeways, I have to be honest about cap and trade. And so, double-edged sword. In California, am I going to say that, you know, we haven't been working hard on cap and trade funds and that we haven't been, you know, we as advocates haven't been trying to shape how these programs have been created and built and that they aren't doing good? No, they are. They are doing good. But the issue with cap and trade still remains, and you're going to hear this from a lot of environmental justice communities, is that it is flawed. It is fundamentally based on the idea that those who have, you know, excess emissions, more emissions, you're trading that through, right? So you're not actually tackling the problem of emissions for those communities, which typically tend to be, again, those Black, Brown, Indigenous communities who are bearing the weight of that pollution. You're not tackling that problem, right? You're slowly starting to figure out, like, how do we trade? How do we use a market tool to address something? And so there's a challenge in that for ourselves, right? When we're talking again about both the climate crisis and when we're talking about racial justice, there really does need to be a conversation of like, well, what do we do and what do we think about when we start to think about funding mechanisms and tools to address both? And how do we create, I think, just strategies that aren't, I think, continuing to burden, I think, these communities with excess pollution, even if we're getting, I think, climate funding, or even if we're getting reductions from this. So I'm gonna end there and I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Chanell. Stephanie, I'm gonna pull up your first slide.
I too want to just echo my appreciation for being able to join this conversation with both Beth and Chanell. It is very rare that you get three women who feel passionate about transportation, but also the environment in our communities. And for me, one of the things that I really want to bring into this conversation is the human element to all of this. What we know is that your zip code has more of a social determining factor of your life expectancy than your genetic code. And I want to re-emphasize that your zip code, where you live, plays more of an impact on how long you live than your actual genetic code. And when you think about that reality, and you think about what climate change means in communities, it becomes so personal to the reality of this moment. And as we think about this moment, as we are talking about Black Lives Mattering, being able to name the challenges of systems that have not worked for people for decades and generations, and even as we think about this public health pandemic around COVID and the right to breathe, this is where all of these conversations come together. Next slide. And so for me, as I think about this, and especially when we talk about transportation, it's easy to say emissions and not get the impact of polluted air. That you have communities of color that for generations have not had the privilege of breathing clean air for our right to drive. And I want to bring it home specifically when you start to really break it down by the numbers, the sheer numbers of what we are talking about in this moment, that 1 in 3 Latinos live in an area that violates the federal standards of air quality. That Black and Indigenous people have the highest asthma rates compared to any other race or ethnicity. And only because Chanell's on the line, just being able to bring it home even to California, where we have about 44% of Latinos in communities with poor air quality compared to 25% of non-Latinos. 1 in 3 Latinos and Black people living in the top 20% of the most polluted, impacted communities, compared to only 1 in 14 whites. It really becomes a different type of conversation when you think about that privilege of being able to breathe and thinking about it as a privilege. And for me, when we have this discussion, next slide, it is more than just the race, but then when you compound the conversation on climate change and you realize whose neighborhoods are consistently flooded, where they live, and how that impacts their resiliency to life, in part because there were policies and decisions that were made before they arrived and even after they arrived that did not honor their voice or their conversation. As a policy advocate, it is so critical, in my opinion, for us to have a different type of conversation. Next slide. But moreover, I want to also emphasize that this is not just a Black, white, Latino, Indigenous conversation. This is literally about saving ourselves as a nation. That what we are seeing is that overall the life expectancy, and more recently, the white life expectancy has fallen for many reasons. And a part of those reasons include our access, limited to, and our ability to connect in very different ways to the resources that we need to thrive. Next slide. And so for me, and you can just go ahead and hit until we do this, this is more of a conversation of really understanding our past. So I sometimes describe myself as a cultural bearer, and I practice the art of remembering. And in part, it's important for us to understand our history as we build policies, because we are building on legacies that out exist things that we fully understand. As Chanell was explaining, when we built our infrastructure 60 years ago, it was a different America where you could segregate without question, that separate but unequal policies were completely acceptable. And that was the era that we built our highways and our interstate systems. And we divided communities all across this country by race and by class. And I think that class piece sometimes gets left out, because in rural Americas, there were towns that no longer exist because there was not an offshoot to your neighborhood, to your community. No one has driven through your town in years in the same way because of an interstate system. And that there were decisions that were made where you were not involved. As someone who works at an environmental organization, and I think about the power of what NEPA means and the ability to be able to really have a public voice, our laws that speak to the National Environmental Policy Act, of our decisions of who has a voice and what that means, came from this understanding that when we were building highways in the 1960s, as oil spills were happening across the country, that it was not acceptable for communities to be having the federal government build things in their backyard and not have a conversation as to what needed to be a part of it. And so as we think about how we invest for our future, as our infrastructure is aging, there is a real opportunity to build back in a very different way. Before I move from this slide, I also want to connect that notion of housing to this discussion, because as Chanell explained, this is not just a conversation about our transportation system and the notion of where it's limited. A lot of this discussion was focused on cars. I want to bring in even the power of our freight. The notion that every time we click on that online ad to purchase something and those trucks come through our neighborhoods, they go through our ports, it is often the same neighborhoods that are relegated and are the sacrifice zones for that purchase. And the air quality is what is killing people. And so they're going to work and they're not understanding why they are dying at a faster rate. Why grandma is able to not live past a certain age. And it just becomes an acceptable way of life when it doesn't need to be. We have the solutions for being able to address climate change. We see other sectors being able to make very different decisions to ensure that we are no longer part of the reason why we see these extreme weathers playing out in our communities. But we haven't made the decision to actually do something different. And so when we even look at where housing was available and who had access to those housing areas, you fully also understand that that land use, that notion of the flood-prone neighborhoods are the same flood-prone neighborhoods that we see today. That when you overlay the neighborhoods that were redlined and you overlay what that means in terms of the areas that they flood, those two areas are still the same. So when we have this conversation about transportation, it is an interconnected conversation as to how we want to live as a community. And the notion of smart growth goes beyond the conversation of being brilliant, but more about being human in the ways that we think about our policies. Next slide. And so I really challenge us to really think about how do we plan, especially because many of the folks on this line are planners, in a way that we all thrive. Next slide. And really think about both our process, our policies, the programs that we advance that really co-create and lead with solutions that really talk about equity. And in spaces, it may need to be racial equity. In some places, it may need to be income-based conversations, right? It's a different conversation depending on where you live, but being able to ensure that you are really engaging the appropriate community voices and being able to ensure that those who are most impacted actually have a seat at the table and can be part of the solution as we are deciding where we move forward as a country. Next slide. The other piece is really thinking about who is impacted. Who has had to carry the burden of the privilege of being able to do that one click, of being able to think about where you get to drive to, of being able to think about who has access to transportation and transit more specifically. And really thinking about how do you decrease that burden? How do you think about those who are left out? How do you address those unintended consequences that you may not have planned for? Next slide. And then also really thinking about it from a whole systems approach. So it's interesting because when we have some of these conversations, we may just start with the planning. We want to make sure that people are involved. So we ask them all the things that they want to see. And that's the last time that we have the conversation. But we don't go back in the design. We don't go back in the construction. We don't build in the solutions for communities and small businesses that may be impacted as part of it. We don't engage it as an economic opportunity space, right? Like when we build infrastructure, those are billions of dollars that are going into communities, but many times the communities that live there don't get a chance to benefit from it. We plan for who's coming, not who's here now. And we don't think about what it would require to continue that operation and maintenance long after that physical infrastructure is done, right? We talk a lot about the importance of the state of good repair, but in part, it's because we love to build shiny objects, but we don't like to maintain them. And I'm not saying that every system, every road, every bridge needs to be maintained, because sometimes when we are filling that pothole, we are reinforcing those same inequities that have divided communities. But I do want us to do a level of assessment. I do want us to center community at the heart of what we're talking about, whether you're in rural America, suburban, urban. This is a conversation about the region and making sure that it can thrive, that affordability is real, that we're thinking about how the system can be resilient to life's challenges, politically, socially, and environmentally, and that we are building in greater efficiencies so that the complete transportation life cycle really works for people. And this conversation separately can be had even at a policy level. We develop many policies, but where things fall apart is when we actually go into the implementation. Once that policy has been approved, that's when we leave community out as to how we actually do those pieces. And we've got a lot of beautiful laws on the book, but the enforcement to ensure that we are complying with those rules and those laws don't offer the same pieces. So we need to continue to fully complete that cycle of how do we enhance that policy? How do we make it better? And return back again as to how we really think about these pieces. Final slide. I will just close out by really saying that when we think about some of these pieces, it really requires both intent and intentionality, right? And the ways in which we are building this. In part because the system does exactly what it's supposed to do. It stays the course. And unless you do something different, you will continue to reinforce many of those same policies. When we have a conversation around race and equity, oftentimes folks say, that was not me. And you're right. But if you are not doing anything different to stop the system from burdening specific groups of people or addressing those unintended consequences, then you are part of the problem. And so one of my favorite quotes in this moment is really MLK, and it talks about the fact that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. But that means that it requires us to be arc benders. It requires us to push the system, to shape it, to bend it towards the proper directions that really ensure that communities can thrive as part of it. Final slide. What I will say is that I am grateful for this opportunity in part because 8-year-old Stephanie gets to really live out her vision of being able to ensure that we have a space where all communities are able to thrive. And I really hope that this conversation is more than a discussion, but it will encourage you to do something different. Thank you.
Thank you. So I could spend an incredible amount of time chatting with you all about every issue that you all raised. I am going to take moderator's privilege to ask 2 questions before we invite those who are attending to come in. One is on climate and one is on equity. On climate, it is actually, let's start with equity just because it's coming off of all of what Stephanie said, and I think particularly the charge that you've given us to be arc benders requires us to really think about what that means. There's so much that we need to do, and like you said, because of what we have inherited, even just doing something like filling a pothole is giving new life to something that could have caused and often did cause great damage to the community. But when we go in to fix it, we need to consider many of the past offenses we've committed. What is the best way to involve the communities that we are saying we want to help to figure out the right way to help them at this point and make sure they can participate in the benefits of that investment? And I'll start with you, Stephanie, and then I'll go to Chanell.
I'd say make space. Actually, maybe move out the way. Because I don't think that there's a lack sometimes of vision for what a community needs. You can go to any neighborhood and someone will tell you what you need to do to make something work for them. As someone who has worked at the most local levels of government. And I would also say that if you are asking for solutions, I hope that you have the resources. And there's a trauma attached to planning, which is that many communities have been overplanned and underpromised in the delivery of the services that we say that we're going to offer. We ask a lot of good ideas in the planning side, but when it comes to implementation, we don't fulfill those promises. And when you talk about a nation that doesn't always honor its promises on the values that it says that it stands for, it's really hard to want to engage. But I think we have a new opportunity. And I think that's the place that we can really build from. So I would actually also really encourage, especially when we think about long range plans, right? Like that we are really also building the financing for it. One of my favorite theories actually comes from Angela Glover Blackwell from PolicyLink, the original founder. And she talks about this notion called the curb cut effect. That when we were really moving forward in advancing the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 90s, this was a policy that was meant for one group, but we have all benefited from it. We have all rolled our suitcases along that curb cut. We have ridden our bikes, maybe we shouldn't have. We have roller skated, and we've also used that automatic door opener. And this was a policy that was meant for one group, and yet everyone has been able to benefit from it. And that theory kind of builds off of what John Powell talks about, which is targeted universalism. When you address the needs for those who are most at need, the entire community is able to benefit. So you need to find the person who is most impacted by the system to be part of the solution, or plan for that in mind when you are building and planning for the future.
I think that's absolutely right. I've definitely benefited from a lot of those very interventions that were not necessarily meant for me. I think about when I injured my knee and taking a step off a curb hurt a whole heck of a lot, and pushing a stroller. And we forget how much the system is designed in an unadvantageous way, even for the most privileged, until we actually think about the vulnerable. Chanell, you are in a position of trying to advocate for climate interventions, but you're often talking to communities that have not been well served by other interventions. How do you put this conversation together and include those who've traditionally been left out in a new conversation about how to move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think first I want to echo everything that Stephanie said. I thought it was brilliant. And I was like, yes, exactly, especially with a curb cut, referencing Angela Cover Blackwell. I think the other thing I would say is that, and this goes for me, myself as a planner and for Climate Plan, like I've had to learn that we have to flip the script. So I think how we traditionally do planning is that it's very top down and very much like, okay, so I'm gonna get these people together, they're gonna give me input, I'm gonna take that input, develop a plan, do the models, do the scenarios, then bring that back to you, you vote on it. No, we can't do it. Like that whole process is really just truly steeped, and I'm just gonna be really bold with this, it's steeped in a lot of white supremacist culture. And those are uncomfortable terms, people don't like to hear it, but it's like, that's not how we need to do planning if we really want to get to that place where we're talking about visioning from the ground up. What we do need to do is start to think about, one, who is already talking to community members? I think for us, the biggest thing that I've had to realize is that there are community organizations, there are community organizers, I actually have hired one, that have deep relationships with groups in the neighborhood. So instead of you trying to figure out, okay, let me like get this contract to this consulting firm to do public engagement, stop. There are amazing community organizations that could take that money, and we've actually seen that in California, and start to do that public engagement for you. So that's step one, right? It's like, don't do the whole consulting firm, we're gonna take your input and turn it into a plan. Start with visioning. Start with community organizations that are working on the ground. Start with building relationships, building trust. That's step one. Then I would say, and again, these are lessons that I had to learn myself and the Climate Fund had to learn too. The step two and the most important thing is be prepared that the community does not want to talk about what you want to talk about. So you might say, there's a pothole, we want to get that pothole filled. The community might say, you know what though? We have been trying to cross, Fruitvale for years and years and years, and there is absolutely no way to do it. And that is the most important thing for us. And then you have to come in and you have to flip the script. And I think that goes back to what Stephanie said about resources. We need resources, not just for what you want us to do, but we need resources for what needs to be done. And like Stephanie said too, we already know. And I keep saying we because I grew up in South Sac, and it was I could tell you what the problems were in my neighborhood that needed to be fixed, but who was listening? Now I live in Alameda, and Alameda is very different because in Alameda, everybody feels very empowered to say exactly what's wrong, and people are listening. And if you're not familiar with California, Alameda, I would say, tends to be a more white kind of Asian bedroom community of the Bay Area. South Sacramento is far more diverse and tends to be a lower kind of disadvantaged community up in California, Northern California. So the main point is right. It's be prepared to shift to what we need, not what you want us to do. And I think the third and final point, and I think for planners, it's really hard because we want to see ourselves as being neutral, and we want to see ourselves as we're just neutral, we're coming in, we're going to help you figure out the problem, and then we're going to find the solution. I think there just needs to be a really honest conversation about bias and how we come into communities thinking that we know the solution. I mean, that's what you're trained to do. I don't know, everybody has gone through urban planning programs. We're trained to think of ourselves as the solution creators. And I think we have to do ourselves, check our own bias, check our own technocratic, let's throw out all of those, confusing acronyms, and just stop and say, you know what, we want to be invited in your community. We want to figure out, how do we use this system that has hurt you in the past? How do we acknowledge those traumas? And how do we start to build something better? And I use the word trauma intentionally because, as Stephanie pointed out, right? Your zip code determines so much that creates trauma that then we need to heal from. So I think that, and I mean, those are lessons that I think planners can use, but honestly, if you're a statewide organization, you need the lessons too. We need those lessons because we can continue to perpetuate trauma as we're taking power and if we're not thinking intentionally. And I say we as an advocacy organization. So that's what I think I have to be very clear about too.
Well, and
Can
as
I
we
just say,
oh, go ahead, Stephanie, please.
I just have to say, I want to hit one piece that Chanell is talking about, which is I have to, as a Black woman, right? I have to consistently decolonize my own mind. Like, so if I have to do that, fully understand the level of work that is required for everyone to do that. And so there is this need for us to fully understand that just because you have letters behind your name does not mean that you fully understand a community. You can never be an expert of a home that you have never lived in. You don't know what makes that community thrive for someone else. And being able to understand that and go in with that level of cultural humility is probably the greatest gift that you can give yourself as a professional, right? That you are consistently willing to learn and relearn and unlearn and do things differently in the ways in which you think about your plans. And that is a portion of the problem, because we have these visions for how things should be. And we want to build off of what we were talking about 20 years ago. We've got different challenges since that point. Okay, so we have to think about how we do something different. And I would just add one more piece to what Chanell said, which is that you need to pay for community expertise. You pay for consultants, but you are not willing to pay for the community to show up, to have a meal, to have a babysitter show up. Like build that into your budget, please, because it is critical if you want them to be part of the conversation. You value the expertise of an outside consultant, but you don't value community expertise in the same way. You do not set aside money to pay for their time. If you want their knowledge, give them a stipend, okay? Like, I could do a whole TED Talk. I'll leave this alone for right now. I'm so grateful though for the opportunity, for real.
Well, but I think that this is really important, because when we think about planning for climate, we forget that all of this is wrapped up in that conversation, that there are real short-term benefits we can get by finding out that if people could cross the street safely in that area, they'd walk to the shopping center and not have to drive or not be able to get there at all. And if you want to talk about that crossing, it has to involve listening to the neighborhood and not doing things according to the existing system. And that coming into a community and saying, we're going to let it rain electric vehicles doesn't get at any of these issues. So the interrelationship is really powerful, and it's something we all need to be aware of. I'm going to go ahead and open up questions for from folks who are attending, since we don't have a ton of time left.
Great, thanks, Beth.
Sure.
And thanks to everybody who submitted. We're only going to be here till about 2 o'clock, so we only have about 13 minutes for questions, but I'll ask a couple here. First one is from Catherine Schwartz, who mentions that decisions are being made here in New York State to put a lot of money into infrastructure for electric cars and rebates for buying electric cars, so the rich people will benefit the most, and they will be selling their gas-driven cars to the poorer people, taking them off public transit, etc. What kind of suggestions do you have about how we can change the situation and the discussion in local communities?
Who wants to take that first? Chanell, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I think that's something that honestly we're wrestling with in California, and I'm really transparent about that. I'm not anti-electric vehicles, but again, it comes back to like, what is the need? What we have found has been the most effective way to counter that has been just power building. And I think I would say for policy wonks like myself, and this is why, again, I go back to community organizing and being so powerful, intentional. Who are you partnering with is the big question to me, right? It's like, because if you are, a statewide grass tops group, it becomes more and more essential to build power. And then to build power, it becomes essential to, I think, partner with community organizations that have people power. That's what we found to be really effective. I also think the other thing, though, is that you got to make sure And this is just me speaking like it's me and you. And I don't know you, Kathy, but I'm going to say the truth is that you got to make sure that what you're pushing for is what people actually want. And that's the other key thing that we had to realize ourselves was like, well, wait a second, are we on an island alone by ourselves talking about quote unquote VMT? Or because I mean, if community folks aren't talking about that, that's a problem. So if you already see and you're seeing that a lot of groups are saying, hey, no, this is not what we need. We don't need this charging infrastructure. We need more money into like transportation. It's like, one is like help people by sharing out like, who do you talk to? Like some of those things like, who do you talk to? Who are the decision makers? How do we power map? How do we build power together? How are we talking about agreements and sharing power? And like all those conversations, I think are what needs to happen. And I think that's, a really big way to start moving forward and pushing against like just raining down electric vehicles.
Stephanie, do you have anything to add?
I'm sitting in a space of tension, just recognizing the policies that I advocate for. So I'm just going to be fully transparent and just name the fact that the issue to me is not the electric vehicle, it's who has the privilege of owning one. The fact that you have to spend 2 hours because your transit system in your community is not reliable. And that's not fully the case for New York City, but I would say if you're not in New York City, that may be the case, right? And so are there rebates that offer some incentives for low-income homes to be able to own a car so that she does not have to take 12 buses to get to where she needs to go to? Could be another part of the discussion. And I would also sit with, we need to have reliable transit systems for everyone. Like that should be an availability if you want it. My biggest piece is giving folks the options. And right now, that's not what we have. Not everybody wants to live in the city, and that's okay. So you may need to have a car, but who has access to it and what those incentives look like are not created equal. And then it's also a land use discussion. Not everyone wants to live outside of the city, but they can't afford it any other way, right? And we are seeing the suburbanization of poverty. And so now you're pushing people out who have relied on and been in the cities that they've loved, and now they have to go further and further out in suburbs that weren't built for like intentionally not built for cars, right? And so, or for transit to be able to be there. And like, you need to have a car. And being able to hold those pieces. I sit in the tension all the time. And my biggest piece is, again, start with who, right, is most impacted and have that conversation with them for what they need. Because the issues that you may need in Canton, New York is completely different than what you may need in Manhattan. And understanding and addressing the challenges from those various perspectives, I think helps to get to it. And recognizing that a system is dynamic and interconnected. So it's not enough to just talk about the EV cars, but also the public transit available and the housing that may be available as part of the discussion.
John, what else you got?
Okay, next question here is, if red line areas overlap with high flood risk, does that argue in those areas a mobility approach rather than a place-based reinvestment approach would make more sense?
So it's both, right? Like people also love where they live, right? Like I'm a Jersey girl. I love the shore. I was always an everyday environmentalist. But when Sandy hit our shores, it hit so differently for me, the impact of climate change. And again, it's about giving folks the options that they need. And for some people, those are their community homes. They've got generations. And if they choose and they want to, we got to really think about how we really support that level of transition. And I also think that you shouldn't have been forced there. So for those who want to leave, how do we offer that level of relocation? What does that look like as part of the discussion? How do we build in resiliency and natural-based solutions to address what we're seeing? Some of these things can be addressed in different ways, and there's not one solution for it. And I think that's the problem. We come with a one solution policy for what is a very difficult conversation.
Okay, next question, since we don't have that much time. What suggestions do you have for land use nonprofits to make their expertise and power on land use accessible to impacted communities?
Chanell, I'm going to throw that to you.
Now, that's a great question, because that's something that I think we're working on ourselves, and it's the same thing. I think the biggest thing, and I probably am just at this point a broken record when I say this, is who, like, start to do that. And I mean, I say like landscape analysis, but I really mean like start to think about who could benefit from your services, reach out and then say like, do you need them? I mean, that's what we've honestly had to do. We've had real conversations around, hey, this is what we can do. This is what we can help you with. Do you need it? And I've had some people say, you know what, we're good. And I say, okay, I respect that. And I back off, right? And I've had other people say, no, we really need your help. And then it's a process of figuring out, well, like, what do you need my help with? How do we do that? I think to me, the real tension becomes one, like, we don't parachute in. So we believe in like self-determination. We understand that people have the right to say yes and no to those services. That's one. Two is understanding who you want to help and why you want to help them. Making sure that you don't have a white savior complex, which is not, I think, relegated to just being white, but just in general, how we want to operate. And then three, and most importantly, is how do you get the resources to help those communities? And I think the ultimate goal, again, is like making sure that those resources get shifted to those communities, right? So like maybe it's like, I'm starting to get some of this to help you, but my goal is to introduce you to this funder, you to this resource so that you can do it on your own. And I can basically I'm basically working myself out of a job. And that's how I think about this work. But I really do believe that it really comes from a place of like partnership and, again, being very clear and intentional about how you are showing up.
Chanell, I love that last point you made about working yourself out of a job. We should be looking to use tools more often that we can hand off and not be the people with the black box approach who you always have to come back to explain how your latest idea might or might not work. If all we have are tools that work like that, then those tools aren't very valuable. Do we have time for one more question?
Thanks. Yeah, let's ask one more and then we'll ask for some closing thoughts here. So here's a question from Jacqueline Dare. Thinking about affordable housing, what are some approaches to engage and problem solve with middle-class homeowners in coming up with housing solutions?
Stephanie, I know you have a ton of thoughts about housing. Would you like to go first?
I guess I would just make an argument on the premise. Why do you have to have a conversation with middle class owners to have the conversation on affordable housing? And I guess it might be based off of where you live. What I will say is this, there are other ways to really kind of think about how you create cultural districts and communities that really offer the space. Some people have different solutions for what they may want to see, but what I will also maybe elevate. In the town that I worked for, we had two different cities, and it was two different neighborhoods, really two different realities. And I think in many communities, that's the case just because of the way that our infrastructure was built out and who had access to it. And I think it's less of a conversation around a sacrifice, but more so how can we come to this conversation based off of the assets of a community and what we're trying to do collectively. I think when you come to the conversation from a deficit mindset, it's hard to really have a more inclusive discussion because it's already built off of the negativity that may be, assumptions in our premise. So I think there are different ways to engage community to see the overall value or wanting to engage, and it may not be just numbers. It may be more about the quality of life and pieces that they want to, that they want their community to be able to be built on. One that's more inclusive of more groups. And sometimes that's not the case. And it's okay. You can leave the resistors where they are. The goal is to have the majority, right? And that starts with 3 powerful people who are willing to lead, 4, 5, 6, 7 who can be swayed, and you leave the resistors. And I think sometimes we spend so much time thinking about who's not with us versus having the majority of who's for us. And being able to build the majority starts by organizing from that baseline number.
I would also add that I was very influenced by a study called Neighborhood Defenders, that the way we do public outreach to the communities you're talking about gives the community that will experience the bulk of the change the overwhelming authority to veto it, rather than the regional actors who wouldn't necessarily show up at little neighborhood X's outreach session, but would show up to an affordable housing discussion regionally, leaves them out. So there's no balance. And so avoiding only doing your outreach with the community that is most impacted, they should of course be involved. But you can balance it in ways that it's accessible for people who talk about why the affordable housing will be beneficial too, so that you're not setting yourself to only hear from the people who don't want to hear the construction noise, for example. It's hard to have an affordable housing strategy across a region and make sure people live close to the things they need when the people who are resisting the change are those who are most concerned about construction noise. And we've got to find ways to address both and have everybody heard. I know we are need to finish up, and so if there are any final thoughts you have, Chanell, I'd love for you to share them now.
My biggest thought is just gratitude, because I think being, as always, being on these panels, it's always like a learning opportunity for me in a lot of ways. And so I think one of the things that really hit home with me was, I think, that point that Stephanie made about we spend so much time on those who aren't with us. And I think for me, I was just thinking about that, and a lot of work that we're doing at Climate Plan, we're really pushing and pushing and pushing against these structures. And it was a reminder that I'm like, you know what? Yes, there are a million, not a million, million's a lot. There are a lot of people that aren't with us in this, but that is really a deficit mindset. And so I think that's kind of an encouraging word to everyone, right? Is thinking about who is with us, like who is helping us move this forward? How do we build those stronger partnerships? And so I think that was kind of a message for me, but also just really a lot of gratitude being with both of you guys on this panel, and really excited to kind of see what happens and what comes from it. So thank you guys.
Stephanie?
Same level of gratitude. This year, 2020, has been an illumination year. Even in this dark moment, it has brought so many things to light and to bear. And I hope that we all take the charge to be arc benders wherever we are. I think it's easy to say that we don't have power, we don't have access, and we have so much on this call collectively, and there's so much that we can do. So I look forward to building back better in these next few years and really thinking about how we all thrive. So thank you.
And I will add to my gratitude. I have to say we've had a very rough 2020 with a global pandemic and a lot of communities that don't have much space for people to move about. And they tend to be the very communities we're talking about, the ones where we built highways and major arterials through. And I've been inspired to see how those communities have come forward and how their local governments have come forward to take that roadway and make more space for people, something that we should have been doing before, but maybe can do more of going forward. And I'll just finish my gratitude for you two ladies who are incredible collaborators in this pursuit. And I just cannot wait for my next opportunity to work with you all again. And I will hand it back over for the closing of the session.
Great, thank you, Beth. With that, we'll conclude our webinar today, Transportation, Climate, and Equity, a Smart Growth Dialogue. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great discussion today. To everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Please keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including one on Thursday, the bird-friendly and biophilic city, integrating safe natural habitats into urban design and planning with Tim Beatley of the University of Virginia, and Blueprint for Greening Affordable Housing with Kim Vermeer and Walker Wells next Thursday. Have a great day.